We often picture evil as this grand dramatic force, maybe lurking in the shadows, personified by almost cartoonish villains.
Right. Big, obvious evil.
But what if it's not always like that? What if it's something more subtle, insidious even, potentially woven into like everyday interactions, closer than we think?
That's a really unsettling thought, isn't it? The idea that evil isn't just some external monstrous thing, but it can show up in quiet ways, persistent actions.
Yeah.
In individuals, sure, but also in groups, maybe even institutions, often kind of hidden in plain sight.
Exactly. And that's the difficult territory we're stepping into today. But importantly, it's also hopeful ground. Welcome to the deep dive. So our mission here is simple. We take a whole stack of material articles, research notes, and we drill down to the crucial insights, the surprising stuff, the things you really need to grasp without getting totally lost.
Cutting through the noise.
Precisely. And today, we're doing a deep dive into a really challenging, but I think profoundly important book, M.Scott.Peck's People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil.
Ah, yes. It's a powerful book, kind of a companion piece to his more famous The Road Less Traveled trilogy.
Right.
But here he moves from personal growth and love right into grappling head-on with, well, human malevolence.
Yeah. And our source material for this dive is a really thorough review and analysis of Peck's book. It pulls out his core arguments, the key insights, even the controversial bits. So for you, the listener, our goal is to unpack Peck's unique definition of evil, understand the, frankly, unsettling traits of those he calls people of the lie, explore his blend, sometimes controversial, of psychiatry and theology.
Which is fascinating in itself.
It really is. And look at how evil can show up in groups.
Yeah.
And then, crucially, find that thread of hope for healing that the title promises.
It's definitely not light reading. Exploring the darker side of human nature, relationships. It can be tough.
No doubt.
But this deep dive, it's designed to help you get right to the heart of what Peck's getting at, offering insights that can be, well, incredibly clarifying, even if they make you a bit uncomfortable.
Okay, so let's just jump right into Peck's central idea about evil. It's pretty provocative. He doesn't just see it as, like, the absence of good.
Right. Or simply a psychological issue, like a disorder we can just label.
He frames it as something active, willful even, a force.
That's the key distinction, yeah. It's not just passive badness. His definition is, well, it's stark. Evil is the use of power to destroy the spiritual growth of others.
Okay, hang on. The use of power to destroy spiritual growth?
For the purpose of defending and preserving the integrity of our own sick selves, it's got this moral weight, a sense of deliberate intent to harm someone else's growth, specifically to protect their own fragile, unhealthy self-image.
Wow. Destroy the spiritual growth of others for the purpose of defending our own sick selves. That's incredibly specific and chilling. It's not just being mean or selfish. It's an active destruction of someone else's positive path.
Rooted in their own profound sickness, as he puts it.
Right.
And he argues the central defect isn't necessarily the bad act itself, the sin, you might say. It's the resolute refusal to acknowledge it. This active effort to dodge guilt, to avoid facing what they've done, that builds up layers of self-deception. And that turns individuals into these people of the lie, these masters of disguise.
Masters of disguise. And what's fascinating is how he contrasts this with, ordinary sin. We all fall short, right? You do things you regret. But that often comes with guilt, or at least discomfort. Peck sees that sense of personal sin as crucial, like a healthy safeguard against sliding into this deeper thing.
Precisely. Feeling that discomfort, that twinge of conscience, that's actually a sign of spiritual health. In his view, it's the self-awareness, the humility that acts as an internal brake. Peck argues this particular kind of evil is committed by the self-righteous who think they are without sin because they are unwilling to suffer the discomfort of significant self-examination.
Self-righteousness, that refusal to look inward honestly, that feels like the really dangerous turning point. If you genuinely believe you're faultless, perfect.
You lose those internal checks entirely.
And if you can't see your own flaws, where do they go? You project them. You push them onto others, making them the problem.
Which then justifies harming them in their eyes. It removes the internal resistance to doing harm, the lack of self-examination, that refusal to feel guilt. That becomes the fertile ground where this evil can really take root and just grow unchecked.
So given that framework, what does it look like in practice? What are the actual characteristics of these people of the lie that Peck describes? The source material lists quite a few, and they're pretty disturbing.
It does lay them out. They're often marked by kind of spiritual laziness. Narcissism is a big part of it. Deceptiveness, greed, self-absorption, sloth. A defining trait is just this absolute refusal to acknowledge their own failures or imperfections. They're constantly projecting their shortcomings onto other people.
They sound, well, exhausting to be around, for one thing.
And profoundly destructive. They seem to thrive on creating confusion, using lies, operating with twisted motives. And underneath it all is this pervasive desire for control, for dominion over others. They're described as being kind of bored by divine things, anything that points beyond their own ego. They act like scapegoating narcissists, lashing out viciously if anyone critiques them or threatens that carefully crafted self-image.
And willing to sacrifice anything, basically. Relationships, truth, other people's well-being.
Right.
Just to keep up this facade of being faultless.
Absolutely. The source really highlights that they consistently cause suffering to those around them, often in subtle, insidious ways that are hard to pin down, hard to name.
Yeah.
But underneath that polished, maybe even pious exterior, Peck says there's this profound internal terror.
Terror.
Yeah, a deep, crippling fear that their false front will somehow crumble and reveal their imperfection. So they expend enormous energy, constantly, maintaining this facade through masterful distortion and manipulation of reality.
Wow. That must be incredibly draining, even if they project strength or control on the outside.
Immensely draining. And this constant effort, this terror of being exposed, it fuels their external actions, the need to control, to scapegoat, to destroy anything they see as a threat.
And it makes them resist change.
Deeply resistant. They tend to avoid introspection, therapy, precisely because the discomfort of potentially confronting their own flaws is just unbearable for them.
So it creates this terrible self-reinforcing loop. Refuse to see failure. Deep self-deception, desperate need to defend the fake self, expend huge energy on pretense and distortion, internal terror of imperfection, leads to external harm like control, scapegoating, destruction, and then intense resistance to any kind of help or change that might actually break the cycle.
That captures it really well. It's a deeply entrenched, destructive pattern he's describing.
Now, one of the most striking things about Peck's work, and kind of unusual, is how he tackles this. He's coming at it from multiple angles at once. He's a clinical psychiatrist grounded in science.
Right.
But he also dives deep into theology and spirituality.
Yeah, that interdisciplinary approach was pretty groundbreaking. And definitely controversial for some. He pulls heavily from vivid incidents in his psychiatric practice. The source mentions some fascinating, sometimes really disturbing case studies, like that account of a patient who seemed to physically transform during a session, suddenly resembling a writhing snake of great strength, with eyes hooded with lazy reptilian torpor.
Whoa, that imagery.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't forget that easily. The source review notes how readers find these clinical examples, however unsettling they are, actually really helpful.
In what way?
For understanding perplexing people or situations they run into in their own lives. It makes this abstract idea of evil feel disturbingly tangible, real.
It does, but he doesn't stop at the purely psychological. He explicitly brings in spiritual and theological concepts. You know, the book is categorized under things like good and evil psychological aspects, but also psychiatry and religion.
Right. So how does he actually integrate concepts like, say, Satan or hell into a psychiatric framework? That seems like a huge leap.
It's a unique perspective. He suggests that what we might call the devil isn't some totally independent entity, but is actually called into existence through human narcissism.
Called into existence through human narcissism.
Yeah. And in his view, it has no power independent of a human body. Satan, or this force, must use humans to act malevolently. Like, it can't commit murder except through human hands.
So the source of the evil isn't purely external, like some separate demon out there.
Yeah.
It's tied inextricably to human choice, human nature.
Exactly. It's internal to the human condition, he seems to argue, though it can feel like an external force once it gets a hold. And his view of hell is similar, not a literal place of fire, but a self-created state, a profound separateness from God resulting from their own choices. People in this state, they're there by their own refusal to change, they despise altruism, they relish taking.
And they could leave?
Theoretically, yeah. If they could drop their pride, seek forgiveness, but their deep-seated hatred prevents it. It's a choice, ultimately.
It sounds like he presents a pretty stark view of existence, almost binary.
He does, yeah. It's kind of like either submit to God's goodness and love or refuse to submit to anything but your own will, which paradoxically leads to becoming enslaved by these malevolent forces he's describing. He doesn't seem to see much middle ground there. And he believes this kind of deep evil can only really be combated through the presence of God or goodness. He cautions strongly against going on external crusades against the devil and others.
Focus inward.
Versus the internal struggle for God in themselves. That's the real battleground.
He also touches briefly on other theological views, right? Like Hindu or Buddhist ideas.
Yeah, the source mentions he acknowledges views like good and evil being two sides of a coin, or the Christian idea where evil, through free will and struggle, can actually act as fertilizer for spiritual growth.
So he engages with different perspectives.
He does, shows his breadth of reading, but his core framework definitely integrates Christian thought with clinical observation in a way that was pretty radical for its time. And perhaps his most challenging call is for science, specifically psychiatry, to move beyond just secular reductionism, to openly engage with studying evil by incorporating spiritual, religious, even what some might call supernatural dimensions.
That's a direct challenge to the standard scientific materialist viewpoint, isn't it?
Yeah.
Suggesting that some forms of malevolence might need a moral or spiritual lens to be fully understood. That limiting the scope might mean we miss something essential.
It really pushes the boundaries of conventional thinking. And yeah, it was definitely a point of contention for many in the scientific community. Still is, probably.
Which leads us right into some of the more controversial aspects of his work, doesn't it? Like his idea to classify evil, maybe not just as a behavior, but as a distinct variant of narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah, that specific proposal, that's a big point of debate within psychology. Peck suggested this particular variant would stand out because of its pervasive destructiveness, the subtle but constant scapegoating, an extreme intolerance to any criticism, an intense focus on public image, and a high degree of intellectual deviousness. Clever manipulation.
But the huge challenge with that, even if it makes sense clinically, is that these individuals almost never seek help, right? Because that self-deception is just so deep.
Exactly. They don't see themselves as having the problem. The problem is always out there with other people. So that creates a massive hurdle for traditional therapy, even for classification. How do you diagnose and treat something that actively resists even being acknowledged by the person experiencing it?
Right. It creates a real tension within clinical psychology.
It definitely.
And then there's the part that probably raised the most eyebrows. His discussion of spiritual warfare, potential possession, and even exorcism.
Yes, that's highly controversial territory.
Right.
He dedicated a whole chapter to it and even recounted participating in a few exorcism rituals himself.
As a psychiatrist.
As a psychiatrist. Now, the source review does note that while this is way outside the norm, Peck seemed to approach it in what the source calls a balanced and cautious way. He acknowledged that most things can likely be explained psychiatrically, but he maintained a serious, open-minded regard for the possibility that there might be a spiritual or even demonic realm influencing human behavior in some extreme cases.
So he wasn't just throwing science out the window. More like suggesting science might not have all the answers for all observed phenomena. Keeping an open mind to things at the very edge.
That's how the source frames it, yeah. An attempt to bridge the empirical and the metaphysical. Not abandoning science, but being open to phenomena at its limits. It's undeniably a debated part of his work, especially in secular fields.
Absolutely. And then another really significant debate the book sparked is about the ethics of using language like evil or even monsters to label individuals.
Oh, yeah. This is a crucial ethical point. Critics, like Heidi S. de Jong, who the source discusses, argue really strongly against using terms like monsters as a noun for people.
Okay, so what's the distinction they're making?
They differentiate between calling actions monstrous, which acknowledges the horror of what was done, and calling people monsters. De Jong argues that labeling people that way actually is joining them in the indecency of dehumanizing people.
Wow. Joining them in dehumanizing. Why is that specific labeling seen as so problematic?
Well, several reasons. It's seen as reductionistic. It kind of dismisses the immense complexity of how something like evil could take root in a person. It simplifies things too much. The source quotes de Jong again, saying it decomplexifies the relationship between the imago Dei, the image of God, and the depravity of a person.
The imago Dei.
Yeah.
The idea being that even in the worst depravity, there's still, at some fundamental level, a connection to the divine image,
Yeah,
that potential.
exactly. And that dehumanizing language, by stripping away that inherent dignity or potential connection, is seen as dangerous. It could pave the way for further violence, diminish our understanding of sinfulness, not just in them, but maybe in ourselves too.
Right.
And crucially, critics argue, it eliminates the possibility of, or hope for, transformation. If someone is just a monster, then what hope is there?
That's heavy. The source also includes that powerful quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, doesn't it?
Yes, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being.
That Solzhenitsyn quote cuts through every human being. That really shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from seeing them as inherently different monsters and towards acknowledging the potential for evil within all of us.
It does.
So the ethical debate is, even when you're faced with profound destructive evil, is there still an imperative to preserve some level of dignity? Or at least the idea of the possibility, however remote, of transformation or some kind of restorative action?
That's the core question, yeah. Does the language we choose inadvertently participate in the very dehumanization that characterizes evil itself? And does that language help or hinder the ultimate possibility of healing, no matter how difficult or unlikely that seems?
Peck doesn't just keep his focus on individuals, though. He broadens it out to look at how evil can manifest in groups, even in society.
Right. He explores collective evil.
Yeah.
He shows how groups can sometimes exhibit traits really similar to individual pathology. Self-centeredness, a lack of collective conscience or introspection, rationalization, blaming others, but with a critical amplifier: dispersed responsibility. Being part of a group makes it way easier for individuals to take part in harmful stuff without feeling the full weight of personal blame.
Yeah.
He talks about groups reacting to setbacks with hostility, showing a kind of collective malignant narcissism.
Dispersed responsibility. That feels like a really key mechanism there. Everyone does their little part, and somehow no one feels fully accountable for the awful outcome.
Precisely. He uses the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War as a major example. The shared moral accountability just got severely diminished by the group dynamic.
What factors did he point to?
Things like having a very homogenous unit, a clear division of roles where people just focused on their task, a breakdown of overall unit cohesion, specialization that maybe neglected broader ethics, and even technology creating psychological distance from the victims.
And the source review we looked at also discusses how Peck's insights, especially on this collective evil and dispersed responsibility, have been applied by others to understand really politically charged situations.
Yes, the source material itself uses Peck's framework to analyze and understand what it specifically refers to as Israel's political evil in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Okay, and this is critical. We need to be really clear here, as the source is. This is an application of Peck's ideas by the source material to a specific conflict. It's not Peck's own direct analysis of this particular conflict, right?
Exactly. And we aren't endorsing the specific viewpoints presented in this application. We're just reporting neutrally on how the source material uses Peck's concepts in this instance.
Understood. So, focusing purely on how the source applies Peck's concepts to this specific situation, what aspects of what it calls Israel's political evil does the source claim are illuminated by Peck's framework?
Okay. Well, the source claims to see Peck's idea of intellectual deviousness used to create confusion. It gives the example that, according to the source, Israel persuaded the world they, the invaders and occupiers, are the true indigenous people of Palestine, which the source calls cloaking colonialism in biblical legitimacy. The source also claims scapegoating is employed, using the example of Hasbara, which the source describes as scapegoating Palestinians as you-hating terrorists.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how does the source apply Peck's idea about that dread of imperfections and the demand for affirmation?
The source claims this shows up as Israel's ceaseless demand for Palestinian recognition of its right to exist, while, according to the source, not offering reciprocal recognition. The source also applies Peck's insights on hatred and dehumanization, claiming this is exemplified by labeling Palestinians as culturally, politically, and spiritually inferior.
And the source directly links this application of Peck's framework to the Hamas action of October 7th.
Yes, the source claims that this analysis of what it calls Israel's political evil provides the necessary context for understanding the Hamas action. It emphasizes, according to the source, that the soul-crushing occupation and the relentless theft of Palestinian land constitutes the highest form of violence.
Right.
Again, just to reiterate, We're simply presenting the source's viewpoint and its specific application of Peck's concepts as we found it in the material we reviewed, neutral reporting.
Absolutely. It's a very heavy and obviously challenging application of Peck's ideas to a deeply sensitive and ongoing conflict. It certainly highlights how, according to this source's interpretation, concepts of collective evil can operate through political narratives, actions, and institutions.
It does, and it reinforces Peck's point about the dangers inherent in specialization and dispersed accountability within complex systems. How individuals, maybe within a political or military structure with very narrowly defined roles, can lose sight of or just compartmentalize the broader ethical implications of their actions or the system's actions.
So, after wading through such heavy, complex material, what makes this book still so highly regarded? The source review was quite positive overall.
Yeah, despite the difficulty, the source calls it incredibly insightful, especially for understanding those perplexing people and situations that just defy easier explanation. It's seen as empowering for readers, too, providing great insight into how easily we don't see what we don't want to see, kind of forcing that uncomfortable self-examination Peck insists is so vital. The framework it offers is described as both enlightening and deeply thought-provoking.
And its contribution to thought, blending psychology and spirituality, seems significant.
Many consider it one of the most important books ever written, precisely for that unique blend. It makes a strong case that Christianity, when you dig into it deeply, offers really valid insight into human nature. It definitely challenges conventional morality and pushes readers into often uncomfortable self-reflection.
One of the most unsettling insights mentioned in the review is the idea that evil people are most likely to be found within the church. Using piety as a disguise, that really flips your assumptions.
It's a jarring thought, isn't it? Challenges where we expect to find goodness or evil. The source also highlights Peck's fascinating, almost backwards question, why is there good in the world?
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's not just rhetorical. It genuinely flips the common assumption that the world is naturally good but gets contaminated by evil. Peck's question hints that maybe it's a naturally malevolent world that's been mysteriously contaminated by goodness.
Wow. That's a profound reframing of the basic state of existence. And for such heavy, deep subject matter, the writing style itself gets consistent praise.
Yes, repeatedly. Described as compellingly written and accessible. A real page-turner, hard to put down, filled with thought-provoking content.
That accessibility must be key.
Absolutely crucial, I think. It allows readers to engage with these deeply uncomfortable truths about evil through vivid, relatable case studies and stories. It makes the ideas really land with impact, even when they're hard to face.
So, after navigating all that darkness and complexity, is there really hope for healing? The book's title explicitly promises it, The Hope for Healing Human Evil.
It does, and the source material really emphasizes this as the book's ultimate crucial message. Healing, in this context, Peck argues, needs an approach rooted not just in detached clinical objectivity, but in genuine empathy. The goal isn't simply to denounce evil or even destroy it, but to facilitate transformation, however hard that path might be.
What kind of transformation does that require?
It demands a profound dedication to altruism, to really seeking understanding, a willingness to endure significant personal sacrifices. And critically, the willingness to transform one's own innermost being into a field of conflict.
Transform your inner being into a field of conflict.
Yeah. Peck suggests a kind of love-centered technique to try and convert our natural revulsion towards evil into a force for potential salvation through radical altruistic love. Ultimately, the hope resides in love itself.
And it starts, like he suggested earlier, with acknowledging our own need for spiritual growth.
Yeah.
Confronting our own potential for darkness.
Absolutely. That fear or avoidance of uncomfortable self-examination that stunts our growth. And according to Peck, it creates the very ground where evil can flourish. So confronting those darker impulses within ourselves is an essential first step towards personal transformation and maybe even as a defense against greater evil.
And despite the disturbing subject matter, the depth of depravity he explores, the source notes Peck still writes with compassion, with understanding. He never fully closes the door on the potential for transformation.
Yes. And from that theological angle, the concept of the Imago Dei, the idea that all people, however fallen, still bear the divine image, implicitly suggests there's always this inherent possibility for redemption, for transformation, even in those he describes as people of the lie. So the antidote to evil's destruction and dehumanization, as Peck presents it, seems to be this radical, incredibly difficult altruistic love.
That's the only true path back towards aligning with that inherent divine image, even in the most seemingly depraved states.
Which implies, then, this ethical imperative to preserve that sense of human dignity, to hold open the possibility, however faint it seems, of restorative action, even when you're facing profound evil.
Precisely. It's a demanding ethic.
We have definitely covered a lot of difficult but really important ground in this deep dive. Peck's challenging definition of evil, rooted in that refusal to acknowledge sin.
His unique interdisciplinary blend.
Yeah, psychiatry and theology, the unsettling characteristics of the individuals he describes, the ways evil shows up collectively.
Grappling with the controversies, too.
Right. And crucially, that hard-won message of hope he ultimately offers.
Yeah, this deep dive, it provides a powerful framework, maybe uncomfortable, but powerful, for understanding some of the most complex parts of human behavior, relationships, even societal issues. And it really challenges you, the listener, doesn't it, to look not just outward at the world, but inward, to consider your own relationship with good and evil, with truth and self-deception.
And maybe to leave you with that final thought from the source material, something to really mull over long after this is done. The idea that healing evil isn't just a detached analysis, the clinical classification,
Right.
but a deeply personal, arduous moral undertaking, one that requires you to transform your own inner being into a field of conflict. What does it actually mean for you to engage in that inner conflict? To wrestle with that line Solzhenitsyn says cuts through every single human heart.